Robert Bob Mitchell's trembling fingers froze on the bathroom light switch, his Purple Heart pajamas soaked crimson where the neck mass had torn open during the night. The metallic taste of fear filled his mouth as he stared at his reflection. The same terrified eyes that had watched his squad die in the Mekong Delta 56 years ago. This wasn't the harmless, fatty tumor 4 VA doctors had promised him it was. Martha's coffee cup shattered against the kitchen floor when she found him collapsed against the sink, blood pooling on the Christmas Eve tiles like spilled wine. Her scream pierced the pre-dawn silence, echoing through their small Michigan home where 51 years of marriage photos watched from hallway walls. The wedding ring she'd worn since 1973 caught the bathroom light as she pressed towels against his neck, remembering how he'd once promised her that Vietnam was behind them. Now the war had followed him home, wrapped around his throat like a noose. "Call 911, sweetheart," Bob whispered, his Marine training fighting panic. "Something's killing me, and it ain't given up." What enemy had been hiding in his body for half a century? And why was it choosing Christmas to finally strike? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The ambulance sirens wailed through Heartland, Michigan's snow-covered streets like a banshee announcing death's arrival. Martha Mitchell clutched her husband's calloused hand as paramedics worked over his pale form, her mind racing back to 1973 when she'd first met this broken soldier at a USO dance. He'd been 24 then, all swagger and hidden pain, promising her that the nightmares would fade and they'd build something beautiful together. 51 years later, that promise lay bleeding on a gurney. Robert Bob Mitchell had been many things: decorated Marine, Bronze Star recipient, small-town mechanic who could resurrect any engine, but he'd never been a complainer. Even when the VA rated his disability at 60% for shrapnel wounds and chronic pain, he'd simply nodded and limped back to his garage. Even when arthritis forced him to sell the business in 2019, he'd just smiled and said retirement would give him more time with the grandkids. But this was different. This mass on his neck had appeared 6 months ago like an unwelcome visitor, growing from grape size to tennis ball overnight. 4 different VA doctors had poked and prodded, each delivering the same dismissive verdict. "Just a lipoma, Mr. Mitchell. Fatty tissue. Nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about. The phrase had become Martha's bitter mantra as she watched her husband lose 15 pounds, develop night sweats that soaked their sheets, and spike fevers that left him delirious and calling out names of long-dead Marines: Tommy Rodriguez, Kenny Walsh, boys who'd never made it past 19, now haunting Bob's 73-year-old dreams. Their modest ranch house on Maple Street told the story of a working-class life well lived. Mortgage paid off after 40 years of double shifts. Grandchildren's artwork covering the refrigerator. Bob's Purple Heart displayed next to Martha's Teacher of the Year plaque from 1998. But medical bills had been eating their savings like termites. $20 copays and prescription costs, gnawing away their security. Martha had taught 3rd grade for 37 years, watching generations of Heartland children learn to read and dream. She understood patience, persistence, and the power of believing in someone when they couldn't believe in themselves. Those skills had served her well, married to a man who'd come home from Vietnam with invisible wounds that never quite healed. Their children, Michael, a firefighter in Detroit, and Sarah, a nurse in Phoenix, called every Sunday, worried voices asking the same questions. "How's Dad doing? Any word from the VA? Do you need money?" The grandkids, Emma, Jake, Lily, and little Christopher, still believed Grandpa Bob was invincible, the man who built tree houses and told stories about fixing helicopters in the jungle. As the emergency room doors swallowed her husband's stretcher, Martha whispered a prayer she'd been rehearsing for 5 decades. "Not yet, Lord. We're not finished yet." But deep in her teacher's heart, she feared that whatever was growing inside Bob's neck might have different plans entirely. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had seen her share of Christmas Eve emergencies in Heartland General's understaffed ER, but the sight of Bob Mitchell's neck mass made her pause mid-examination. What the patient's VA records described as a benign lipoma looked nothing like fatty tissue. The 8-centimeter growth pulsed with angry red inflammation, hot to the touch, and weeping a foul-smelling discharge that reminded her of battlefield infections she'd studied in medical school. "Mr. Mitchell, I need you to be completely honest with me," Dr. Walsh said, her voice gentle but urgent. "When did this really start bothering you?" Bob's eyes darted to Martha before settling on the ceiling tiles. The admission came out like a confession at Sunday Mass. "June, maybe July. Started small, like a mosquito bite that wouldn't heal. But Doc Peterson at the VA said it was nothing, just old man problems." Martha's sharp intake of breath cut through the antiseptic air. "June. Bobby, you've been hiding this from me for 6 months?" Her voice cracked like thin ice, 51 years of marriage suddenly feeling fragile. "I knew something was wrong. The way you'd wince, putting on your shirt, how you stopped hugging the grandkids. Didn't want to worry you, sweetheart." Bob's weathered hand found hers, thumb tracing the wedding ring he'd placed there in 1973. "We already spent near everything on your gallbladder surgery last year. Figured it'd go away on its own." Dr. Walsh studied the latest blood work, her frown deepening with each abnormal value. White blood cell count through the roof. Inflammatory markers that suggested systemic infection. Temperature spiking to 103.2 degrees, despite the Tylenol they'd given him in the ambulance. This wasn't benign anything. This was a medical emergency masquerading as a routine growth. "I'm ordering an immediate CT scan," she announced, already reaching for her phone. "And I want infectious disease to take a look. This pattern doesn't fit any standard presentation I've seen." The waiting room clock ticked toward midnight as Martha paced worn linoleum floors, her Christmas Eve dress wrinkled and stained with Bob's blood. She'd called both children from the ambulance, Michael promising to drive down from Detroit as soon as his shift ended, Sarah booking the next flight from Phoenix. The grandkids were spending Christmas Eve with their other grandparents, blissfully unaware that Grandpa Bob might not make it to morning. When Dr. Walsh returned 2 hours later, her expression carried the weight of bad news wrapped in medical terminology. "Mrs. Mitchell, the CT shows multiple fluid collections around the mass, with what appears to be a thick capsule wall. This isn't a lipoma. It's some kind of chronic abscess formation, possibly from a long-standing infection." "Infection?" Martha's teacher instincts kicked in, demanding clarity. "What kind of infection grows for months without proper treatment? That's what concerns me. Your husband mentioned he's a Vietnam veteran. Did he ever contract any tropical diseases during his service? Malaria, dengue fever, anything requiring hospitalization?" Bob stirred on the gurney, consciousness floating in and out like tide pools. "Monsoon season, 68, he mumbled. "Whole platoon got sick. Jungle rot, they called it. Medics gave us pills, sent us back out." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. 56 years of marriage, and Bob had never mentioned being seriously ill in Vietnam. How many other secrets had he buried in that stubborn Marine pride? "Bobby, why didn't you ever tell me?" "Ancient history, sweetheart. War's over." But Dr. Walsh was already pulling up Bob's military medical records on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm seeing multiple entries here for fever of unknown origin and tropical syndrome during your second tour. Were you ever definitively diagnosed or treated for specific pathogens?" "Hell, Doc. Half the time they didn't know what was killing us. Just threw antibiotics at everything and hoped for the best." The emergency room's fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry insects as Dr. Walsh made the call that would change everything. "I'm admitting you tonight for IV antibiotics and emergency surgery consultation. This mass needs to be drained and biopsied immediately." Martha's mind reeled with the financial implications. Emergency surgery, hospital stay, specialist consultations. Their Medicare supplemental would cover some, but the deductibles alone could bankrupt them. "Doctor, we're on fixed income, Social Security and a small VA disability check. How much are we talking about?" "Let's focus on saving your husband's life first, Mrs. Mitchell. We'll figure out the rest later." As orderlies wheeled Bob toward the surgical floor, he grabbed Martha's hand with surprising strength. "Remember what I told you on our wedding day, for better or worse, in sickness and health." "I remember, you stubborn old Marine." "Well, sweetheart," Bob whispered, his eyes holding hers with the same intensity as their first dance 51 years ago. "Looks like we're about to find out what worse really means." The MRI machine hummed like a mechanical prayer as Bob Mitchell disappeared into its tunnel, Martha watching through the observation window while snow continued falling outside University Hospital. 2 days after Christmas, and their world had shifted from holiday joy to medical nightmare. Dr. Patricia Romano, the infectious disease specialist, studied the emerging images with the intensity of a detective examining crime scene photos. "Mrs. Mitchell, please sit down," Dr. Romano said, her voice carrying that particular gravity doctors reserved for life-changing conversations. "These results are unusual." Martha remained standing, her retired teacher's instincts recognizing the tone that preceded devastating news. 51 years of marriage had taught her to read the signs, the way medical professionals cleared their throats before delivering verdicts, the careful spacing of words designed to cushion impact. "What we're looking at isn't a tumor at all, Doctor," Romano continued, pointing to the ghostly white images on her computer screen. "Your husband has what appears to be a complex encapsulated abscess, multiple fluid-filled cavities surrounded by thick scar tissue. The formation suggests a chronic infection that's been present for, well, potentially decades." "Decades?" Martha's voice came out as a whisper. "How is that possible?" Dr. Romano turned from the monitor, her expression mixing professional concern with something deeper, recognition, perhaps even anger. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you something very specific. Has your husband ever been to Southeast Asia? Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam?" The question hit Martha like a physical blow. She sank into the plastic chair beside Dr. Romano's desk, memories flooding back. Bob's reluctance to talk about the war, his dismissive attitude toward tropical diseases, the way he'd minimize any illness that might connect to his military service. "Vietnam. 2 tours, 1967 to 1971. 3rd Marine Division." Martha's hands trembled as she spoke. "But Bobby always said he came home healthy. A little shrapnel, some hearing loss, but nothing serious." "I'm going to order a very specific blood test," Dr. Romano said, already typing orders into her computer. "We're looking for antibodies to a bacterium called Burkholderia pseudomallei. It causes a disease called melioidosis, and it's endemic to Southeast Asia." Martha had never heard the word before, but something in Dr. Romano's tone made her stomach clench. Is it treatable?" "If caught early, yes. But Mrs. Mitchell, this organism has a particularly insidious characteristic. It can remain dormant in human tissue for decades, creating what we call time bombs. Stress, aging, compromised immune systems can reactivate infections that have been sleeping since the original exposure." The implications crashed over Martha like a cold wave. "You're saying Bobby's been carrying this since Vietnam? For 56 years? "It's possible. The imaging shows classic signs of chronic melioidosis. Multiple abscesses with thick capsule walls, the kind of formation that develops when the body tries to wall off an infection it can't eliminate. Dr. Romano pulled up Bob's military medical records on her screen, scrolling through decades of entries that told a story Martha had never heard. "Look at this pattern, Mrs. Mitchell. Starting in 1968, your husband reported recurrent fever episodes, joint pain, respiratory infections, all dismissed as tropical syndrome or post-deployment adjustment." Martha read over the doctor's shoulder, her teacher's eye catching details that painted a horrifying picture. Multiple hospital visits between 1969 and 1975. Complaints of night sweats, unexplained weight loss, chronic fatigue, each entry stamped with the same dismissive conclusion. Symptoms nonspecific. Continue observation. "They knew," Martha said, her voice hardening with realization. "The military doctors knew something was wrong, but they never properly investigated." "Mrs. Mitchell, I've seen this pattern before with Vietnam veterans. Many tropical diseases were poorly understood in the 1960s and 70s. What we now know requires sophisticated testing was often missed or misdiagnosed." The blood test results arrived within hours, confirming Dr. Romano's suspicions. Burkholderia pseudomallei antibodies were present at levels indicating chronic active infection. The enemy that had been hiding in Bob's body since his 20s had finally decided to launch its final assault. When Martha returned to Bob's room with the news, she found him struggling to sit up, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. "What's the verdict, sweetheart? Am I going to make it to see another Christmas?" Martha took his hand, feeling the wedding ring that had grown loose on his shrinking finger. "Bobby, do you remember getting sick in Vietnam? Really sick, not just the usual jungle rot?" Bob's eyes grew distant, traveling back across decades to memories he'd buried deep. "Monsoon season, '68. Whole squad came down with something fierce. High fevers, couldn't keep food down. Lost 30 pounds in 2 weeks. What happened? How were you treated?" "Field hospital for maybe a week. They pumped us full of antibiotics, declared us fit for duty, sent us back out." Bob's laugh held no humor. "Hell, Martha, half of us were still running fevers when we returned to patrol, but the Corps needed bodies more than they needed healthy Marines." Dr. Romano appeared in the doorway, her expression grave. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to start aggressive antibiotic therapy immediately. This infection has been destroying tissue for decades, and we're running out of time." "How much time?" Bob asked, his Marine training cutting through emotion to tactical reality. "With treatment, potentially years. Without it." Dr. Romano paused, meeting his eyes directly. "Weeks, maybe less." Bob squeezed Martha's hand, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern of her knuckles. "Well then, Doc, looks like this old Marine's got one more battle to fight." But Martha was already thinking beyond the medical crisis, her mind racing toward a larger injustice. How many other veterans were carrying similar time bombs? How many had died without ever knowing their enemy's true name? The IV antibiotics dripped into Bob's arm like liquid hope, each drop carrying the promise of battle against an enemy that had occupied his body for over half a century. But by January's second week, hope was becoming an expensive luxury the Mitchell family could no longer afford. The hospital bills arrived daily like artillery bombardments. $3,200 for the emergency room visit, $8,500 for the MRI, $12,000 for the first week of IV treatments. Medicare covered portions, but the co-pays and deductibles were bleeding their savings dry. Martha sat in the hospital's financial counselor office, staring at numbers that might as well have been written in a foreign language. "Mrs. Mitchell, your husband's treatment protocol could extend 6 to 8 months, the counselor explained with practiced sympathy. "We're looking at potential costs approaching $85,000, not including surgical intervention if the antibiotics fail to reduce the abscess size." "We don't have $85,000, Martha said quietly. Her teacher's pension and Bob's Social Security never intended to cover medical catastrophes. We have maybe $12,000 in savings, and that's after selling Bob's tools and my grandmother's china." Meanwhile, Bob was discovering that fighting a microscopic enemy required different tactics than jungle warfare. The high-dose antibiotics left him nauseated and weak, his appetite disappearing along with 15 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. Worst of all, the treatment wasn't working fast enough. The neck mass remained stubbornly large, occasionally weeping the same foul-smelling discharge that had first alarmed Dr. Walsh. "I feel like I'm poisoning myself to stay alive," Bob confided to Martha during one of their long hospital vigils. "Maybe it's time to accept that some wars ain't meant to be won." "Robert Eugene Mitchell, don't you dare give up on me now," Martha snapped, using his full name the way she had when scolding him for tracking mud through her classroom 40 years ago. "We've survived Vietnam, 3 job layoffs, cancer scares, and raising 2 teenagers. This is just another mountain to climb." But privately, Martha was beginning to crack under the pressure. She'd taken to crying in the hospital chapel where stained glass windows filtered winter sunlight into rainbow fragments that reminded her of happier times. 51 years of marriage, and she'd never felt so helpless watching the man she loved fight for his life. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Michael arrived from Detroit for the weekend, still wearing his fire department uniform, and immediately began researching tropical disease treatment centers. "Mom, there's a guy at Johns Hopkins who's written papers specifically about chronic melioidosis, Dr. Alexander Chen. He's treated cases like Dad's before." Sarah joined the conversation via video call from Phoenix, her nursing background providing medical translation. "The key is finding someone who understands the bacterium's behavior patterns. Most doctors see maybe one case in their entire career. Dad needs a specialist." Dr. Chen agreed to review Bob's case files, and his response arrived like a lifeline thrown to drowning sailors. "Mr. Mitchell's presentation is consistent with chronic melioidosis reactivation. While challenging, this condition is absolutely treatable with the correct antibiotic combination and duration. I've successfully treated similar cases with 40-year dormancy periods. But Dr. Chen's expertise came with a price tag that made their current bills look modest. Consultation fees, specialized testing, potential transfer costs to Baltimore. The numbers climbed toward 6 figures while Bob's condition remained precarious. That's when Heartland's veteran community stepped forward with the quiet determination that had sustained small towns through countless crises. Tom Bradley, VFW Post 1247 commander and Bob's fellow Vietnam veteran, organized what he called Operation Homecoming, a series of fundraising events that tapped into the deep wells of military brotherhood. Bobby Mitchell served his country with honor, Tom announced at the January VFW meeting. Now his country needs to serve him back. The response overwhelmed everyone involved. Local businesses donated auction items, church groups organized bake sales, high school students held car washes in sub-freezing temperatures. The American Legion Post in the next town contributed their monthly bingo proceeds. Even competitors from Bob's old garage days, men who'd fought him for customers during lean years, showed up with checks and memories of his honest work. But the most powerful support came from unexpected places. When local newspaper reporter Jenny Washington wrote Bob's story for the Heartland Gazette, it struck a nerve that resonated far beyond their small town. The article, titled "Vietnam Vet Fights New War at Home," was shared on social media platforms where it found audiences hungry for stories of injustice and resilience. Within days, checks began arriving from strangers across the country. A retired teacher in Oregon sent $50 with a note, "For Martha, from one educator to another." A Marine Corps veteran in California contributed $200, writing simply, "Semper Fi, brother." A teenager in Texas donated her babysitting money with a letter explaining how Bob's story inspired her history project on Vietnam veterans. The most surprising donation came from Dr. Harold Johnson, the VA reviewing physician who'd initially denied Bob's claim for service-connected treatment. His personal check for $500 arrived with a brief note. "Sometimes the system fails good people. This is my apology." By month's end, Operation Homecoming had raised $47,000, enough to cover Dr. Chen's consultation and the specialized treatments he recommended. But money couldn't solve the deeper problem eating away at Martha's soul. How many other Vietnam veterans were carrying similar time bombs? How many had died without proper diagnosis, their families never knowing that treatable diseases had been dismissed as age-related decline? Martha found herself lying awake at night, researching tropical diseases and veteran health statistics on her old laptop. The numbers painted a disturbing picture. Thousands of Southeast Asia veterans had reported similar symptoms over the decades: recurrent fevers, unexplained infections, mysterious illnesses that defied standard diagnosis. Most had been told their problems weren't service-connected, their claims denied by a system designed to minimize costs rather than maximize care. "Bobby," she said one evening as they watched snow fall outside his hospital window, "what if this isn't just about you? What if there are hundreds of men out there carrying the same infection, dying from the same ignorance?" Bob turned from the window, his eyes holding the clarity that came with facing mortality. "Then we better make sure my fight means something more than just keeping one old Marine alive." The decision crystallized during Dr. Chen's video consultation when the specialist confirmed what Martha had begun to suspect. "Mrs. Mitchell, your husband's case represents a pattern I've observed in multiple Vietnam veterans. Chronic melioidosis is likely far more common than military medical records suggest. Many cases were probably misdiagnosed or dismissed entirely." Martha felt the familiar fire that had driven her through 37 years of teaching, the determination to fight for students who couldn't fight for themselves. But now her classroom had expanded to include every veteran who'd ever been told their service-related illness was not service-connected. "Doctor," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades advocating for the voiceless, "how do we make sure this never happens to another family?" February 14th arrived with the cruel irony of Valentine's Day turning into the darkest moment of Bob and Martha's 51-year marriage. At 3:47 a.m., Bob's fever spiked to 104.2 degrees, sending alarms screaming through the ICU as his blood pressure plummeted and his oxygen levels crashed. Martha was jolted awake in the family waiting room by a nurse's urgent voice. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need you immediately." The sight that greeted her in room 314 would haunt her dreams forever. Bob lay unconscious, surrounded by a forest of machines keeping his failing body alive. Ventilator tubes snaked down his throat while IV pumps delivered a cocktail of antibiotics, pressors, and fluids fighting to keep his organs functioning. The infection had finally launched its full assault, spreading from the neck abscess into his bloodstream like enemy forces overrunning defensive positions. "We're looking at septic shock," Dr. Romano explained, her usual calm demeanor cracked with urgency. "The antibiotics aren't containing the infection fast enough. His kidneys are starting to fail, and we're seeing signs of respiratory distress." Martha gripped the bed rail until her knuckles turned white, watching machines breathe for the man who'd once carried wounded Marines to safety under enemy fire. "What are our options?" "Emergency surgery to drain the abscess completely. It's high risk given his current condition. We're looking at maybe 60% survival odds." But without intervention, Dr. Romano's pause said everything words couldn't. The family gathered like soldiers preparing for a final battle. Michael drove through a blizzard from Detroit, abandoning his fire station shift when the call came. Sarah caught the red-eye from Phoenix, her nursing experience making her the translator between medical reality and family hope. The grandchildren, Emma, 16, Jake, 14, Lily, 12, and Christopher, 8, huddled in the family waiting room, their young faces struggling to understand why Grandpa Bob looked so small and fragile surrounded by all those machines. "Grandma Martha," Emma whispered, her voice cracking with teenager vulnerability. "Is Grandpa going to die?" Martha pulled her granddaughter close, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo that reminded her of simpler times when Bob would build snowmen and tell bedtime stories about brave Marines who always came home. "Grandpa's fighting the biggest battle of his life, sweetheart, but he's the strongest man I know." The decision to proceed with surgery came down to money as much as medicine. The emergency operation would cost $150,000, funds they didn't possess even with the community donations. Their insurance company had denied authorization, classifying the procedure as experimental for treating chronic tropical infections. The VA remained locked in bureaucratic reviews, unwilling to approve emergency funding for what they still classified as non-service connected. That's when Martha made the choice that would define their legacy. Standing in the hospital billing office, she signed papers putting their house, their only remaining asset, as collateral for the surgical costs. 50 years of mortgage payments, decades of home improvements, memories embedded in every room where they'd raised their children and welcomed grandchildren. "Ma'am, you understand this means if the surgery fails and your husband doesn't survive, you'll still owe the full amount?" the financial counselor asked gently. Martha thought of Bob unconscious upstairs, his body fighting a war that had started when they were both young and believed love could conquer anything. "My husband didn't survive 2 tours in Vietnam just to die because we couldn't afford to save him." The surgery began at 6 p.m. on Valentine's Day, Dr. Romano leading a team of specialists in what she privately considered the most challenging case of her career. Bob's neck had become a battlefield where 56 years of infection had created a complex maze of abscesses, scar tissue, and healthy structures delicately intertwined. In the waiting room, Martha sat surrounded by an unlikely congregation. Tom Bradley and a dozen VFW members maintained military straight postures despite their aging bodies. Pastor Williams from Martha's Lutheran Church led quiet prayers. Jenny Washington, the newspaper reporter whose article had started the fundraising effort, documented the vigil for a follow-up story. Most surprisingly, Dr. Harold Johnson from the VA appeared around midnight, his presence a silent acknowledgement of systemic failures he could no longer ignore. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Johnson said quietly, approaching her with obvious discomfort, "I owe you and your husband an apology. I've been reviewing his case files, and the evidence of tropical disease exposure was there all along. We should have connected these dots decades ago." Martha looked up at the man who'd denied Bob's claims for years, seeing exhaustion and guilt etched in his weathered features. "Dr. Johnson, how many other veterans are out there carrying infections like Bob's? How many have died because the system failed them?" "More than I want to admit," he replied, his voice heavy with regret. "Your husband's case has opened my eyes to patterns I should have recognized years ago. If he survives this surgery, I promise you, changes are coming." At 2:47 a.m., Dr. Romano emerged from surgery looking like she'd fought her own war. Her scrubs were stained, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes carried cautious optimism. "We removed 3 separate abscesses, each one encapsulated in scar tissue that probably formed decades ago. The infection was far more extensive than our imaging suggested." "Is he going to be okay?" Sarah asked, her medical training warring with daughter's desperation. The next 72 hours will tell us everything. We've removed the primary source of infection, but his body has been through tremendous trauma. He's stable for now, but critical. Martha felt her legs give way as Michael caught her, 51 years of accumulated stress finally overwhelming her teacher's iron composure. All their savings gone, their house mortgage to pay for surgery, their future riding on whether Bob's 73-year-old body could overcome an infection that had been slowly killing him since he was 19. As dawn broke over University Hospital, casting long shadows through waiting room windows, Martha sat beside Bob's bed watching machines monitor every heartbeat. His hand felt cold and fragile in hers, but she could swear she felt his fingers respond to her touch. "Come on, Maureen," she whispered, using the nickname that always made him smile. "You've got grandbabies to spoil and a wife who's not ready to be a widow. Don't you dare leave me now." Outside, Valentine's Day snow continued falling on a world that seemed determined to test whether love could indeed conquer all. The machines keeping Bob alive began their symphony of failure on day 3 post-surgery, each alarm a discordant note in Martha's worst nightmare. His kidneys, already stressed from decades of chronic infection and high-dose antibiotics, started shutting down despite the medical team's desperate interventions. The numbers on his monitors told a story of systematic collapse. Creatinine levels climbing, urine output dropping, blood pressure requiring increasing doses of medications to maintain even marginal circulation. "We need to discuss dialysis," Dr. Romano said gently, her voice carrying the weight of conversations no family should endure. "His kidney function has deteriorated to the point where his body can't filter toxins effectively. Without intervention, we're looking at complete renal failure within 48 hours." Martha stared at the woman who'd become both savior and bearer of devastating news, her mind struggling to process how saving Bob's life might ultimately destroy it. "What does that mean for his recovery?" "Dialysis could support him through the acute phase, but Mrs. Mitchell, I need to be honest with you about what we're facing. Your husband's body has been fighting this infection for over 50 years. The surgery was successful in removing the primary sources, but the systemic damage—" Dr. Romano paused, searching for words that could convey medical reality without crushing hope entirely. "We're seeing complications that suggest his immune system is simply exhausted." The financial implications hit Martha like a physical blow. Dialysis treatments 3 times per week, specialized nursing care, potential long-term hospitalization, costs that would dwarf even their current mountain of medical debt. The house they'd mortgaged for surgery might only be the beginning of what this battle would cost. Michael found his mother crying in the hospital chapel that evening, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest wells of despair. "Mom, we'll figure this out. Sarah and I can take out loans, sell our houses if we have to." "Your father would rather die than bankrupt his children," Martha whispered, her voice raw from hours of silent weeping. 51 years of marriage, and it might all end with us losing everything we built together." The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone watching Bob's decline. The man who'd survived enemy bullets, jungle diseases, and decades of physical labor was being defeated by medical bills and bureaucratic indifference. The VA continued their expedited review of his case while his body failed in real time, each day of delay another step toward irreversible organ damage. Sarah arrived from Phoenix with news that should have brought hope, but instead felt like another devastating blow. "I've been researching Dad's case with my nursing colleagues. We found 3 other Vietnam veterans in Arizona with similar presentations, chronic neck masses, recurrent fevers, all diagnosed as non-service-connected conditions." "Are they getting treatment?" Martha asked, though part of her already knew the answer. 2 died waiting for VA approval. The 3rd is fighting the same insurance battles we are. Sarah's voice carried the professional composure of a nurse delivering terminal diagnoses, but her eyes held daughter's anguish. "Mom, this isn't just about Dad anymore. This is systemic negligence on a massive scale." The breaking point came on day 7 when Bob briefly regained consciousness, his eyes focusing on Martha with startling clarity despite the fog of medications and organ failure. "Sweetheart," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ventilator's rhythmic cycling, "I need you to let me go." "Bobby, no!" Martha gripped his hand with desperate strength, as if she could anchor his soul to his failing body through sheer will. "We're so close to beating this. The dialysis is helping. The infection markers are improving. Look at what this is costing." Bob's eyes moved toward the financial documents Martha had been trying to hide on his bedside table. "Our house, the kids' futures, your retirement. I won't let my war destroy everything you've built." "You listen to me, Robert Eugene Mitchell," Martha said, using their children's disciplinary tone from decades past. "I didn't spend 51 years loving you just to give up when things get hard. We took vows, for better or worse, in sickness and health. This is the worst part, and I'm not backing down." But Bob's condition continued deteriorating despite Martha's fierce determination. Pneumonia set in on day 9. His compromised immune system unable to fight the hospital-acquired infection. His oxygen requirements increased while his blood pressure became increasingly difficult to maintain. The specialists began using phrases like multiple organ failure and comfort care measures. Dr. Johnson from the VA appeared at Martha's side during one of her darkest vigils, carrying a folder of documents that seemed to weigh more than their paper content suggested. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've been working around the clock to expedite your husband's case. We found evidence of documented melioidosis exposure in his unit's medical records from 1968. Martha looked up from Bob's bedside, hope and exhaustion warring in her expression. "Does that mean the VA will finally approve his treatment?" Dr. Johnson's silence spoke louder than words, his eyes reflecting the inadequacy of bureaucratic solutions when measured against human suffering. "The approval is moving through channels, but it might be too late," Martha finished, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. 56 years too late. The first revelation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Harold Johnson's trembling hands as he placed a thick manila folder on Martha's lap in the ICU waiting room. His face, weathered by decades of denying veteran claims, carried the weight of a confession that would shatter everything Martha thought she knew about the system that had failed her husband. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to tell you something that could cost me my career," Dr. Johnson began, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father was a Vietnam veteran. He died in 1985 from what the VA classified as complications from alcoholism. But I found his military medical records last week while researching your husband's case." Martha looked up from the folder, seeing tears in the eyes of the man who had denied Bob's treatment claims for years. "What did you find?" "My father had the same symptoms as your husband. Recurrent fevers, unexplained weight loss, chronic infections. The VA told my mother it wasn't service-connected, that Dad's drinking had compromised his immune system." Dr. Johnson's voice cracked. "I've been denying claims like Bob's for 15 years, thinking I was protecting taxpayer money. I was actually covering up my own father's murder by bureaucratic negligence." The folder contained photocopied documents that painted a horrifying picture of systematic cover-up. Internal VA memos dating back to the 1970s acknowledged clusters of mysterious illnesses among Southeast Asia veterans but recommended against expensive tropical disease testing. Cost-benefit analyses that valued budget savings over veteran lives. Training materials instructing claim reviewers to deny tropical disease connections unless overwhelming evidence existed. "They knew," Martha whispered, her hands shaking as she read document after document. The VA has known about melioidosis cases for decades and chose to ignore them. It gets worse, Doctor. Johnson continued, pulling out a laptop computer. I've been reaching out to VA facilities across the country. We've identified at least 200 cases similar to your husband's. Vietnam veterans with chronic neck masses, recurrent infections, all denied service connection. 43 have died in the past 5 years while waiting for treatment approval. The second shocking revelation came 24 hours later when Martha's phone rang at 2 a.m. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Santos, an investigative journalist from the Washington Post. Mrs. Mitchell, I've been following your husband's story through social media. I believe there's a much larger scandal here, and I have documents that prove it. Rebecca had obtained leaked VA internal communications through a whistleblower network of veteran advocates and disgruntled employees. The emails revealed a deliberate strategy to minimize tropical disease claims by requiring impossible standards of proof. Veterans were systematically denied unless they could provide specific documentation of exposure incidents, records that were rarely kept during wartime operations. Mrs. Mitchell, one email from 2019 specifically mentions Mitchell-type cases as examples of claims to be discouraged through bureaucratic delays, Rebecca explained. Your husband's name has been used internally as a case study for how to deny expensive treatment claims. But the third and most devastating revelation was still to come. Martha was sorting through Bob's personal effects, preparing for what seemed like inevitable end-of-life decisions when she discovered a small metal box hidden beneath old photographs in his army duffel bag. Inside were letters she'd never seen, correspondence between Bob and military doctors spanning from 1968 to 1975. The letters told a story of a young Marine desperate for medical help and a military medical system determined to return soldiers to combat regardless of their health status. Bob had written dozens of requests for continued treatment of what he described as the fever sickness that won't go away. Each response was the same. Symptoms were non-specific, treatment was adequate, and return to duty was mandatory. One letter, dated March 15, 1969, made Martha's blood run cold. Private Mitchell, your reports of continued fever and neck swelling have been reviewed by military medical authority. These symptoms are consistent with combat stress reaction and do not require additional medical intervention. Continued requests for sick call will be noted in your permanent record as potential malingering. Martha realized with growing horror that Bob had been trying to get proper treatment for his infection for over 50 years. He'd never hidden his illness from her. He'd been taught by the military to hide it from himself, convinced that his symptoms were either imaginary or signs of weakness unworthy of a Marine. The most damning document was a carbon copy of a letter Bob had written to his mother in 1970. Ma, I keep getting sick with fevers and this lump on my neck keeps growing. The docs here say it's nothing, but I know something's wrong. Don't worry though. I'll keep fighting it until I can come home and get real help. Martha sank to the floor of Bob's hospital room, surrounded by decades of evidence that her husband had been betrayed not just by the VA system, but by the entire military medical establishment. Every time she'd asked him why he never mentioned being seriously ill in Vietnam, he'd told the truth. In his mind, he'd never been seriously ill because authorities had convinced him his symptoms weren't real. Dr. Romano found Martha there an hour later, clutching the letters while Bob lay unconscious just feet away. Mrs. Mitchell, I have some news that might change everything. We just received results from advanced genetic testing on the bacteria we removed during surgery. What kind of results? The strain of Burkholderia pseudo-Mali in your husband's system has genetic markers that match samples from a specific region of South Vietnam, the same area where his unit was deployed in 1968. But more importantly, we found evidence of multiple antibiotic-resistant mutations that only developed during prolonged, inadequate treatment. Martha looked up from Bob's letters, understanding dawning in her exhausted mind. You're saying the bacteria evolved inside him because he never received proper treatment? Exactly. The genetic evidence proves your husband was infected during military service and that his infection was inadequately treated for decades. This isn't just medical malpractice, it's documented proof that the military and VA systems created the very condition they're now claiming isn't service-connected. The final revelation came from an unexpected phone call that would change not just Bob's case, but potentially thousands of others. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, had been following Bob's story through media coverage and constituent pressure. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm calling to inform you that tomorrow morning I'm announcing a congressional investigation into VA tropical disease claim denials. Your husband's case will be the centerpiece of hearings that will examine 50 years of systematic negligence. As Martha hung up the phone, she looked at Bob's unconscious form surrounded by life support machines and realized that his final battle might not be against the infection slowly killing him, but against the system that had allowed it to thrive for over half a century. The war Bob Mitchell had been fighting wasn't just medical, it was moral, and the evidence was finally mounting for a victory that could save thousands of other veterans from suffering the same fate. March 15th arrived with the kind of gentle spring morning that makes miracles seem possible. Martha woke in the hospital chair where she'd spent 73 consecutive nights, her neck stiff from sleeping upright, to find Bob's eyes open and focused for the first time in 2 weeks. Not the vacant stare of delirium or the drugged confusion of heavy sedation, but the clear, alert gaze of the man she'd married 51 years ago. "Morning, sweetheart," Bob whispered, his voice hoarse from the ventilator tube that had been removed just 12 hours earlier. "Did I miss anything important?" Martha laughed through tears she didn't realize were falling, gripping his hand with both of hers as if she could anchor him to consciousness through touch alone. "Oh, Bobby, you missed everything and nothing at all. The whole world's been fighting for you while you were sleeping." Dr. Romano's morning rounds brought news that seemed to defy every dire prediction of the past month. Bob's kidney function had stabilized enough to discontinue dialysis. The infection markers in his blood had dropped to levels not seen since his admission. Most remarkably, the surgical site on his neck showed clean healing with no signs of recurring abscess formation. "I've been treating infectious diseases for 20 years, Dr. Romano told the assembled family, and I've never seen a recovery quite like this. Mr. Mitchell's body seems to have finally won the war. It's been fighting since 1968. But the real victory was unfolding beyond the hospital walls, where Bob's case had ignited a firestorm of reform that would reshape veteran health care for generations. Senator Williams' congressional hearings had begun 3 weeks earlier, with Dr. Johnson's testimony serving as the opening salvo in what media outlets were calling the VA's reckoning. Michael brought his father a tablet computer loaded with video coverage of the hearings, where veteran after veteran testified about tropical disease claims denied for decades. "Dad, you need to see this. Your story opened the floodgates. There are hundreds of guys coming forward with cases just like yours." Bob watched in amazement as veteran advocates presented evidence of systematic claim denials, internal VA documents acknowledging the problem while refusing to address it, and medical experts testifying about the long-term effects of untreated tropical infections. The hearing room was packed with Vietnam veterans, many displaying visible signs of chronic illness, their families holding photographs of loved ones who hadn't survived the bureaucratic battles. The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Johnson himself, who had resigned from the VA to become a whistleblower advocate. Mr. Chairman, I spent 15 years denying claims like Robert Mitchell's, believing I was protecting taxpayer resources. Instead, I was perpetuating a system that condemned American heroes to preventable suffering and death. The evidence was always there. We simply chose not to see it. Martha watched the hearings with a mixture of vindication and heartbreak, knowing that Bob's survival was the exception rather than the rule. For every victory like theirs, dozens of families had lost loved ones to diseases that could have been treated if the system had chosen humanity over cost savings. The financial resolution came through an unexpected source. The congressional pressure had forced the VA to conduct an emergency review of tropical disease claims, resulting in Bob's case being not only approved but classified as a 100% service-connected disability. The decision came with retroactive benefits dating back to his first documented symptoms in 1969, a settlement approaching $300,000 that would not only cover all medical expenses but secure their financial future. 56 years late, but they finally admitted the truth, Martha said as she reviewed the VA determination letter with their attorney. Every penny of this belongs to the families who didn't live to see justice. Bob's physical recovery accelerated with each passing day, but his emotional healing required confronting decades of internalized blame and shame. During one of their long afternoon conversations, he confessed the guilt that had eaten at him since Vietnam. "Martha, I always thought I was weak for complaining about symptoms the doctors said weren't real. For 50 years, I believed I was just a whiner who couldn't handle what real Marines endured." "Bobby, you were never weak," Martha replied, her teacher's voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "You were a 19-year-old kid who trusted the system to take care of you, and that system failed you in the most fundamental way possible. The weakness was never yours. It belonged to the institutions that abandoned their duty to protect you." The broader impact of Bob's case continued rippling through veteran healthcare systems nationwide. The VA announced new protocols for tropical disease screening, mandatory continuing education for claims reviewers, and expedited processing for Southeast Asia veterans with chronic symptoms. Medical schools began incorporating tropical disease recognition into their curricula, while veteran service organizations established rapid response teams for complex cases. Dr. Romano's research team, funded by emergency congressional appropriations, launched the largest study of chronic tropical infections in American veterans ever undertaken. Bob agreed to participate, his case serving as the foundation for protocols that would help identify and treat similar infections before they reached life-threatening stages. But perhaps the most meaningful victory came in the form of letters that arrived daily from Vietnam veterans and their families across the country. Men who had suffered in silence for decades found courage to seek medical attention. Widows who had blamed themselves for their husbands' mysterious deaths finally understood the true cause. Children who had grown up watching their fathers fight invisible enemies learned that the battles had been real all along. One letter particularly moved Martha from a woman in Oregon whose husband had died 5 years earlier. "Mrs. Mitchell, my Jim had the same symptoms as your Bob. Fevers, neck lumps, the VA saying it wasn't service-connected. Reading your story helped me understand that Jim didn't die from old age or bad luck. He died from neglect, and now I finally know it wasn't our fault." The community that had rallied around Bob's crisis evolved into something larger and more lasting. Heartland became a model for veteran-friendly healthcare, with University Hospital establishing a specialized tropical disease clinic funded by continuing donations from supporters who had followed Bob's story. The clinic would serve veterans throughout the Great Lakes region, ensuring that no other family would face the isolation and financial devastation the Mitchells had endured. Tom Bradley and the VFW Post created the Robert Mitchell Emergency Medical Fund, providing immediate financial assistance to veterans facing medical crises while waiting for VA claim approvals. The fund's motto, suggested by Bob himself, captured the spirit of military brotherhood: no Marine left behind, especially on the home front. As spring turned toward summer, Bob's strength returned with remarkable speed. His weight stabilized, the chronic fatigue that had plagued him for decades lifted, and for the first time in 56 years, he slept through entire nights without fever episodes. Dr. Romano's team confirmed what everyone could see. The infection that had been slowly killing him was finally, completely eliminated. On their 52nd wedding anniversary, June 14th, Bob and Martha renewed their vows in a ceremony attended by hundreds of supporters who had become extended family during their darkest hours. Bob stood strong and steady, his voice clear as he repeated promises made over half a century earlier: for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. But he added new words that spoke to everything they'd learned. Martha, you fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. You never gave up when everyone else had written me off. You turned my final battle into our greatest victory. Standing in the church where they'd been married in 1973, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and a community that had refused to let them face catastrophe alone, Martha finally understood that their love story wasn't ending. It was beginning its most important chapter. Bob's survival meant that thousands of other veterans would receive the care they deserved, that systemic failures would be corrected, and that the promise made to every service member that their country would care for them when they came home would finally be kept. The war that began in Vietnam in 1968 had finally ended in victory, not through military might, but through the power of love, community, and an old teacher's refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. Bob and Martha Mitchell's story reminds us that love isn't just about the good times. It's about standing together when the world seems determined to tear you apart. For 51 years, Martha never imagined she'd have to mortgage their home to save her husband's life, or that an infection from Vietnam would try to steal their golden years together. But when Bob lay dying from a disease the VA refused to acknowledge, their small town of Heartland proved that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to let a neighbor fight alone. Today, Bob is healthy, their marriage stronger than ever, and their story has changed healthcare for thousands of veterans nationwide. Sometimes our darkest moments become the foundation for our greatest victories. The Mitchells discovered that happiness isn't the absence of struggle. It's finding people who'll walk through the fire with you. Their love story proves that even at 73, it's never too late for new beginnings, and that the most beautiful chapters of our lives often begin after we thought the book was ending. Questions for you. What moment in your own marriage or long-term relationship tested your commitment the most, and how did it ultimately strengthen your bond? Have you ever experienced a community rallying around you during a crisis? How did it change your perspective on the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.